Thanks very much, Sean, and good evening, everyone. I was delighted to be asked here just to say a few words about what is a really fantastic travelogue. And reading the book, I found my thoughts constantly racing and drifting back to memories of my own Australian adventures, which is actually 10 years ago now. As names of places like Cairns and Coober Pedy and Coogee, Catherine Gorge and Cape Tribulation, I think they're as familiar to the ear of a whole generation of Irish people as rain-soaked places like Bandon and Ballina, Blackrock and Ballybunion. I suppose there's a wide variety of factors that send young Irish on the long pilgrimage to Australia. It has been well documented that thousands are currently leaving because of the economic downturn. I left in 2002, so that was in the middle of the Celtic Tiger when there was plenty of jobs, but I suppose I was looking for a bit of a break from a high-pressure society, and Paul, who was one of the earlier people to go on these year-long visas, he described leaving in the early 90s when unemployment was high. He was in what he described as a dull and dead-end job. And he writes in his book, "I knew the mantra of, you're lucky to have a job well enough, but surely I thought there has to be something better than this." And what Travels with Bertha, I think what it captures is a universal experience for many young Irish who are seeking adventure, whether they be economic migrants, gap year workers or backpackers. Such universal experiences experienced by all young Irish going to Australia include travelling around the country in a beat-up old car. As Sean mentioned, Paul, it was a 1978 Ford Stationwagon called Bertha. For me, it was a graffiti-covered, converted light-ace camper van called Saoirse. But I think some of Paul's greatest adventures, as described in the book, are when his car Bertha breaks down. A few times he ran out of fuel because he hadn't bothered getting the petrol gauge fixed. And one time he hitches a lift to the nearest petrol station to a town called Torrance Creek. Now it looks like it's going to be a major place because on the map, which only has a handful of places but on the 1,500 kilometre journey between the coast and the Red Centre, this is just one of a few. But arriving in the metropolis, he writes, all that was visible on the wide desert landscape were a few run-down shacks, and he later learns from the mechanic in the garage that it has a population of just 21. He also describes his car breaking down and this enormous thundering road train taking more than 100 metres to come to a halt in order just to give him a lift. This astounds all Australians, that he tells later on, because it's totally out of character. Another universal experience means, and this is the universal experience, means not caring when things go wrong, going with the flow, and it results in the best stories and the feeling of really being alive. Back in Ireland, when you're in your 20s and something goes wrong, I think you often feel like the world is falling apart, but it's different in Australia. Another universal experience in the book is the effect which the enormity and emptiness of the landscape has on a traveller. Paul captures this when he visits Rainbow Beach in Queensland, and he writes, "Since crossing into Queensland, the limitless, impassive sky of this country had begun to affect me too. In such pristine freshness, so uncluttered by overbearing historical figures or physical vestiges of civilization, Australia is a place where your mind can roam widely in utter freedom." But it's on his visit to the Red Centre that he reflects more on this emptiness, and he writes, "Aborigines believe that the outback, far from being empty, is peopled by countless spirits, and that evening I knew it was true." He also writes how anyone could ever feel lonely here was suddenly beyond me. The place was just so inhabited and so full. In stark contrast to what I'd always imagined about the Australian bush, the land seemed to me to be the richest, the most replete place I'd ever seen, he added. I think the book offers so much more of an insight for young Irish people who are now leaving for Australia than any Rough Guide or Lonely Planet book could give. It gives an insight into the complex history of the Aborigines, and that's through an encounter with one particular hitchhiker. He's one of many sad and quite bewildered looking alcoholic Aborigines that are on the streets and towns right across the country. And Paul writes about this Aboriginal hitchhiker that although he appeared to know place names, when he was asked about the dream times, which is the Aboriginal myths, he didn't seem to know any. Some dream times are sacred, which might have accounted for his reticence, but the more he talked, the more I was convinced that he simply knew little about his ancestral heritage. And Paul concludes that this loss of connection with the land is in some ways the worst consequence of the white colonisation of Australia for Aborigines. He also gives other stories of Irish immigrants who made their mark on the land, other than the infamous Ned Kelly, which is talked about everywhere. The book tells a story of, not in his book, but in Australia, the book tells of County Monaghan convict Alexander Pearce, who had been transported to the penal colony in Tasmania in the 19th century for theft. He was the only man to escape this penal colony and survive twice. But we learn he only lived by cannibalizing his fellow escapees. I suppose the book does offer some comfort for those who are left behind in Ireland, for the families and friends. There's so much talk here of a lost generation, and there's empty beds and empty spaces in homes across Ireland due to emigration. Irish people, but I suppose the comfort is that Irish people are every day shaping and changing the history of a nation which is 24 hours away. But the Australian experience also shapes them, and ultimately it shapes Ireland when these people return. The book shows how this Australian pilgrimage, which I think has become a defining experience for Irish youth, is something that will always stay under their skin. Perhaps it's best described in a quote, and here I'll finish. Paul describes a scene in the book. He describes a photo of himself and fellow travellers where they have finally made it to the sacred site of Uluru, Ayers Rock, in the centre of Australia. He says of the photo, "It freezes in time that moment of golden youth and adventure that is perhaps only fully experienced once and that can never quite be recaptured." Thank you. Now I'll hand over to the author.